the iniquity permitted by capitalist societies also caused the masses to become susceptible to reactionary ideologies, further igniting the spread of fascism. Hayek considered this argument to be one of the most dangerous lines of reasoning against capitalism, and so he argued in Freedom and the Economic System that both socialism and fascism have common roots in economic planning, and in elevating the power of the state over that of the individual. Hayek wrote, "The main point is very simple. It is that comprehensive economic planning, which is regarded as necessary to organize economic activity on more rational and efficient lines, presupposes a much more complete agreement on the relative importance of different social ends than actually exists, and that in consequence, in order to plan, the planning authority must impose upon the people the detailed code of values that is lacking." Put in another way, Hayek's point was that any attempts to plan the economy in service to goals such as greater efficiency or social justice might lead to the opposite of those intended consequences, because the planner would naturally have to decide which goods and services to create and therefore which desires to satisfy, implicitly making a claim about which desires ought to be valued higher. And in order for the planner to avoid elevating one group's values at the expense of another's, they would naturally require more and more power to dictate economic outcomes, leading to total control over the political process itself. In Hayek's view, only a competitive market system could permit the entire diversity of values to find expression while preserving freedom. The pamphlet also confronted the idea that scientific progress was being constrained by capitalism, and in doing so, Hayek hinted at what would become his next major endeavor in political philosophy. Hayek wrote, "It would be interesting, but it is not possible within the space available, to show how this belief is largely due to the intrusion into the discussion of social problems, the preconceptions of the pure scientist and the engineer, which have dominated the outlook of the educated man during the past 100 years. This argument, that the social sciences had been infected by an erroneous conception of reason that overestimated what reason can actually accomplish, became the focus of a bold new treatise Hayek began at Cambridge, which he called the Abuse and Decline of Reason Project. The project was an enormous undertaking that Hayek worked on for almost the entire duration of World War II. Hayek initially intended to divide this work into two parts, which he called Hubris of Reason and The Nemesis of the Planned Society, and the completed work was meant to demonstrate how false conceptions of individual rationality, originating in France and Germany in the 18th century, had led to modern socialism's view of individual reason as powerful enough to plan and engineer all of society. This, Hayek argued, was inferior to true rationalism, originating in England and Scotland, which emphasized the relative insignificance of individual reason and the absence of deliberate intention behind complex phenomena. Whereas socialists believed enlightened individuals could deliberately plan a just and equitable society, Hayek believed that the spontaneous collaboration of free men would create a society greater than their individual minds could ever comprehend. Ultimately, however, The Abuse and Decline of Reason would never be published in its originally intended structure. Instead, excerpts were published separately in a variety of different forms, including 6 articles published in Economica between 1941 and 1944, which were later collected and published as The Counter-Revolution of Science, Studies on the Abuse of Reason in 1952. It was in these writings that Hayek coined the term scientism, or the mimicry and fetishization of science without respect for real scientific procedure. The final section of Hayek's grand work, originally titled The Nemesis of the Planned Society, is what eventually became The Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom, first published in Britain in March 1944 by Routledge Press, is quite possibly the most important document there is for understanding the origins of modern neoliberal capitalism. It greatly extended all of the arguments Hayek first made in Freedom and the Economic System, and with even more force. It continued to counter the claim made by the leading leftist intellectuals in Britain that fascism was the product of discordant capitalism. It also aimed to demonstrate that just as socialism could never match the spontaneous order of a competitive market system, it also could never protect liberty as well as a competitive liberal society paired with a strong state that valued the rule of law. But most importantly, The Road to Serfdom was imbued with the urgency of a warning that if any degree of socialism, which Hayek considered synonymous with complete economic planning, was permitted, all the greatest hallmarks of Western civilization would disappear, and even historically free countries like the United States and the United Kingdom would begin to resemble Nazi Germany. Hayek wrote in The Road to Serfdom, "We have progressively abandoned that freedom in economic affairs without which personal and political freedom has never existed in the past. Although we had been warned by some of the greatest political thinkers of the 19th century, by Tocqueville and Lord Acton, that socialism means slavery, we have steadily moved in the direction of socialism. We are rapidly abandoning not merely the views of Cobden and Bright, of Adam Smith and Hume, or even of Locke and Milton, but one of the salient characteristics of Western civilization as it has grown from the foundations laid by Christianity and the Greeks and Romans. Not merely 19th and 18th century liberalism, but the basic individualism inherited by us from Erasmus and Montaigne, from Cicero and Tacitus, Pericles and Thucydides, is progressively relinquished. On the topics of competition and planning, Hayek wrote, "Economic liberalism is opposed to competitions being supplanted by inferior methods of coordinating individual efforts. Competition is superior not only because it is in most circumstances the most efficient method known, but even more because it is the only method by which our activities can be adjusted to each other without coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. The increasing veneration for the state, the admiration of power, and of bigness for bigness' sake, the enthusiasm for organization of everything, we now call it planning, and that inability to leave anything to the simple power of organic growth are all scarcely less marked in England now than they were in Germany." On the topics of capitalism and democracy, Hayek wrote, "It is now often said that democracy will not tolerate capitalism. If capitalism means here a competitive system based on free disposal over private property, it is far more important to realize that only within this system is democracy possible. When it becomes dominated by a collectivist creed, democracy will inevitably destroy itself. We have no intention, however, of making a fetish of democracy. It may well be true that our generation talks and thinks too much of democracy and too little of the values which it serves. Democracy is essentially a means, a utilitarian device for safeguarding internal peace and individual freedom. As such, it is by no means infallible or certain. It is largely responsible for the misleading and unfounded belief that, so long as the ultimate source of power is the will of the majority, the power cannot be arbitrary." Hayek was a believer in negative liberty, that the role of the state should be minimized and curtailed to the point of merely protecting its citizens and providing them access to markets, and as such, he accepted the existence of inequality as a necessary feature of society. Hayek wrote, "A necessary, and only apparently paradoxical, result of this is that formal equality before the law is in conflict, and in fact incompatible, with any activity of the government deliberately aiming at material or substantive equality of different people, and that any policy aiming at a substantive ideal of distributive justice must lead to the destruction of the rule of law. To produce the same result for different people, it is necessary to treat them differently. To give different people the same objective opportunities is not to give them the same subjective chance. It cannot be denied that the rule of law produces economic inequality. All that can be claimed for it is that this inequality is not designed to affect particular people in a particular way." In one of The Road to Serfdom's final chapters, The Socialist Roots of Nazism, Hayek explicitly linked the National Socialism of Nazi Germany with the intellectual history of economic planning, turning the tables on socialists who were connecting the dots between capitalism and fascism. Hayek wrote, "It is a common mistake to regard National Socialism as a mere revolt against reason, and a rational movement without intellectual background. If that were so, the movement would be much less dangerous than it is, but nothing could be further from the truth or more misleading. The doctrines of National Socialism are the culmination of a long evolution of thought, a process in which thinkers who have had great influence far beyond the confines of Germany have taken part. What, then, caused these views held by a reactionary minority finally to gain the support of the great majority of Germans and practically the whole of her youth? It was not merely the defeat, the suffering, and the wave of nationalism which led to their success. Still less was the cause, as so many people wish to believe, a capitalist reaction against the advance of socialism. On the contrary, the support which brought these ideas to power came precisely from the socialist camp. It was certainly not through the bourgeoisie, but rather through the absence of a strong bourgeoisie that they were helped to power." Lastly, in The Road to Serfdom, Hayek laid the foundation for one of the core tenets of modern neoliberalism, that political freedom without economic liberty is impossible. Economic policies could not be merely contained within the economic sphere, and the choice to plan the economy or not would in fact have consequences for the whole of society. Given the stakes, the only option was to maximize economic liberty. Hayek wrote, "The authority directing all economic activity would not merely control the part of our lives which is concerned with inferior things. It would control the allocation of the limited means for all of our ends. And whoever controls all economic activity controls the means for all our ends and must therefore decide which are to be satisfied and which are not. This really is the crux of the matter. Economic control is not merely control of a sector of human life which can be separated from the rest. It is the control of the means for all our ends.